so much. And thank you for that generous introduction. I'm really delighted to get the chance to speak to all of you. This is an exciting moment for me. Let me explain a little bit about my talk, which is on time in Shakespeare's day, what time meant for Shakespeare. And this is why I became interested in it. So I'm going to start with something that people say that I do not believe. So this is what I do not believe. There are a number of critics currently who say that Shakespeare's plays took 2 hours to perform, 2 hours in performance, but that when you read them, they are clearly much longer plays. Almost all the plays that we have in written form would take longer than 2 hours. So the argument goes, the argument that I do not follow, the argument is that we don't have the plays in the form in which they were performed. We instead have the plays in a special written up for the page literary form. Now, as I say, I don't think that. And so I started looking into, why do we say that Shakespeare's plays took 2 hours to perform? Did they? And actually, what did 2 hours mean in Shakespeare's time anyway? Now, this talk that I'm going to give will take 1 hour, and I don't know if you can see this. This is a sand glass, an hourglass, and I'm just going to turn it now. Let's see if my talk really will take a sand glass hour. So I'm just going to rest that there. And I'm now going to start sharing my screen. Very much for listening. And now I'm ready to take questions. Oh, and I can see that there are 3 hands up.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. We really lost count of time during it. Okay.
I did wrong though. I've already used up my hour.
Yes, well, yeah, quite accurate. Okay, so I think Abbas is having a question. Please, Abbas, if you are there. Ahmed, do you have a question, please? Islam, are you there? Islam Adil.
Good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Sorry. I would like to say that in the very beginning of the lecture, I was a little bit dumbfounded by the fact that time is approached in Shakespeare's, when it comes to Shakespeare, and this lecture is approached in terms that really doesn't exclude the spectators, what she referred to as real time. When I personally think of time, I often think of it in relation to the chronology and the discordance between time in the story and time in the text. So I know that this is a very open-ended question, but how would you approach time in Shakespeare's plays in terms of this chronology and this relationship between time as it is constructed in the story and time as it is constructed in Shakespearean plays? And also, I have this question concerning the timelessness of Shakespearean creations, because I think that when we think about time and Shakespeare and his creation, and him, Shakespeare as a creative genius, I often think that time is cryptic when it comes to this, because Shakespeare and his creation have seeped into the consciousness of humanity to the extent that I don't think that we would ever feel Shakespeare or any of his creations out of time. The other day, I was reading a very important novel from Iraqi literature, and in this novel, the author adopts Shakespeare as a character. In the whole novel, the novel is called The Comedy of Ghosts. In the whole novel, I never felt that Shakespeare is out of place. So how can I think of time in this relation? I feel that the concept of time is crushed when it comes to this, when it comes to even Shakespeare himself as a creative genius. So in this novel, for example, I see Shakespeare all along the novel as a character going through the hideous events that happened in Iraq 2007, the civil war in Iraq. So when it comes to Shakespeare and his creation, I think that the concept of time is in itself is crushed and is cryptic. And my original question is which is an open-ended question. If we think of time in Shakespeare's place, when it comes to the relation between story and the text, how would you approach it? Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a fascinating question. And I wonder whether the book you mentioned has been translated into English. If it has, I would love to read it.
Okay.
Well, Shakespeare he's so interesting and he's so weird with time in his plays. So quite often he will have two completely different sets of time happening simultaneously in a play. So that, for instance, in Othello, on one level, the story happens overnight, happens over between two days and a night. But on another level, it happens over 3 months. And actually nearly always in his plays, he has two different sets of time. It's the same with in the Henry IV plays. Falstaff and his friends in the tavern have a kind of speedy time, and the king has a slow time with big changes happening in the country. So for Shakespeare, he has a sophisticated use of time and a highly fictional one, such that different characters can live in slightly different time periods, in slightly different units of time. And that makes me think that, as I say, the reality of time would be very confusing for audience members while trying to keep track of what's often two different sets of time in the story Shakespeare is telling. And I think maybe we might in that way be aided by thinking of time in the plays as almost another character or a couple of characters that have their own development and trajectory in the plays. So I don't know, it was an open-ended question and that's sort of an open-ended answer, but I do think, and to take that question on to sort of the lasting nature of Shakespeare and the way Shakespeare has extended over time and still speaks to us now, I think maybe one reason he does that is because of those sophisticated sort of the slight lack of clarity that makes you go back and read the text and find out more from it each time. So yes, so I think his handling of time is one reason why he's still so famous now, but his handling of time is deeply odd.
Okay, thank you. I have raised hand, Ahmed, if you are there.
Yes, thank you, Doctor, for this nice presentation. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Go on.
Thank you, Dr. Stan. Yes, I have to thank you for this nice presentation and these nice informations. I had to add something because Shakespeare, you know, had an interesting way of telling us about time through the movement of the stars as one of his, just like his contemporaries at that time, they were fond of what? Of astrology. This is one. Next, through the hinting of the sounds of animals, crowing. You know, in Hamlet, he is telling us of the appearance of the ghost at this specific time. And his dramas are full of these signs. Thank you for these nice information. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Ahmed. Those are two very important and good observations. Yes, he certainly has natural time expressed through cocks crowing, as in the Richard III example, and he uses that a lot as well. And that's tied in with a sense of time and nature that we saw Shakespeare playing around with. You also said very interesting things about telling the time with the stars. And there is, I could give a whole other talk about how you tried to get hold of time in the night when you don't have the sun. And they had all sorts of things, as you say, telling the time with the stars. They also had a bellman with a bell who would walk around the streets saying what the hour was, 3 o'clock, and also the weather, cold and frosty. So that would be another way of learning the time at night. And those nighttime units were as victim to inaccuracy as the daytime units. For instance, if there are lots of clouds, you can't see the stars, or if your eyes are bad, you can't see them. But as you say, you made a beautiful observation that there's a whole other unit of thought to be had, which is time at night.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you very much. If there are any other questions.
There was a person who was a number rather than a person who was
yes,
keen to ask
I think 00 something, and he disappeared. So if there are any other questions or comments, please try to make them by raising the hand or using the hand tool. Okay, so Tiffany, until we have another question, I just wanted to point out to the fact that maybe some of the audience might be estranged by the kind of spelling that was used in the PowerPoint presentation, because it's the original spelling, and I think many of us, except those specialized in literature, are not familiar with that, because we are using the modern editions which use modernized spelling. So mainly I think they will find difficulty identifying the S in that.
Yes.
Yeah. Go on. Yes, please.
Yes, in Shakespeare's time, printers in printing houses had a box of type in front of them, and they had to pick up bits of type, and they had to pick up a space. You know, everything on the page related to a literal piece of type in the printing house. And in the printing house, you had both our kind of S and also a long kind of S. And one reason why you had both, there were lots of reasons why you had both, but one reason why you had both is that the long S takes up less space than the fat S that we are used to. And sometimes if the printer was having trouble fitting the words of a line, fitting the words onto a single line, he might slightly shorten the words by having recourse to the shorter S. So yes, I'm sorry to have shown you that unfamiliar spelling, but it's also interesting to see what the texts looked like when they were first on the page, I think.
Yes, it's very interesting. I think we have Atyaf Majid, who also wanted to say something.
I'm really interested in this literature, as in next year I'm taking Shakespeare, like his, you know. So this was really interesting to me. You talked about how Shakespeare thinks about his time and how time links to all of his concepts, like his plays. He has like a very strange concept of time. He was like, as his quote, he was like primarily like personified destroyer of absolute bonds. It's like it destroys like lovers, and you know, like time can separate them. But how does this link to his concept of life? Because he has two concepts of time and life.
Yes, I think, as I say, it was interesting to me to realize that when he's angry with time, he might use, when he thinks time is sneaking up, he might use a sundial. When he thinks time is going too quickly, he might use an hourglass. And when he thinks time is comfortably eternal, he uses a clock. So I think he has maybe 3 mental versions of time. And what I think is interesting to us is to realize that that time needn't be conceived of as one single thing. And I think we often, because of our very accurate clocks, we often think of that time is sort of the same every day. So, for instance, I get up at 7 every day, but in the winter, it's dark at 7, and in the summer, it's light at 7. And those are actually, in natural terms, therefore rather different times. And animals might well get up with the sun rather than with a clock hour. So I think our sense of a fixed single unit of time has made us less able to understand Shakespeare's richer sense that time is different depending on the unit you think it through.
Okay. Another participant, a number 001, blah, blah, blah. If you want to say something, please. If you can hear us. Tiffany, until we have this or other participants, I am fascinated really by the fact that churches were the places where most of the clocks were kind of installed. And I gather that Queen Elizabeth, as a politician, was receiving gifts from maybe other rulers of clocks. But the idea of churches and this affinity or this association between religion and time, and how maybe religion raised our sensitivity to time. And even here, when we think about Islamic astrology, which was highly developed and was developed really mainly because of the need to set times for times of prayers or time for fastings and so on. So this need motivated the research and development of astrology, of Islamic astrology, which also fed in European astrology in the Renaissance. So religion is very keen on looking into time and the idea of the life of the human being and the idea of the pre-life or the afterlife and all these stages, and also of history of apocalypse, of resurrection, and so on. All these things are very much a temporal concept. So I don't know if there is something about religion that you find very much keen on time.
Yes, I think, yes, you make a very fascinating point that, yes, religion kind of owned time, and that made sense. You know, the churches were also where you were baptized when you were born, where you were buried, when you died. And so they sort of owned your lifespan, and they kind of owned time, and that became part of your belief. But I think you also made a very interesting point that royal palaces sometimes also themselves had clocks. And one could say that that was maybe a sort of royal attempt to get in on owning time and to be more than just temporal, because otherwise, you know, royalty, like anyone else, they live and die. But maybe they were a little bit trying to own that slightly godly unit by having clocks on their palaces. Yes, so and I think And your question also reminds us that Shakespeare, when he thought about time, well, we've seen he was often thinking about death, but he was also often thinking about God. Now, I know that this poor number is still very desperate to speak. But if 001433 can hear me, I'd be very glad to hear your question.
Anything, please. Okay, Taif, we have another, until the first one is ready.
Yes, thank you so much for this amazing meeting. You are both are awesome. Glad to have you here today. Sir, I have a question. I am an MA student right now. So I have many questions about the MA program in Basra University. So can you help me, please?
Sorry, Taif, if this question is to me, if it is not to Professor Tiffany, you can contact me later. I'd be glad to help with any information that you need. If the question is to me. Okay, thank you, Taif. Zainab?
Yes, Dr. Samer Talib. Yes.
Go on, Zainab. Yeah.
Yes. I would like to say an appreciation word for you, Mr. Dr. Talib. Thank you very much for this invitation to listen to Professor Tiffany Stern talking about Shakespeare's work. Thank you very much. And an appreciation word I would like to present to Professor Tiffany. Thank you very much for this distinguished lecture. I have no question, but I want to say something good. As we know about the English-speaking world, no household probably furnished unless it contains a copy of the Holy Bible and of the work of William Shakespeare. And it is not necessary that these Shakespearean works should be read in maturer years, but they must be present as a symbol of religion and English culture. And as we know that Shakespeare was the supreme genius of the English race, did not begin until he had been dead more than a century. But since then, it has become so firmly accepted that no schoolboy can avoid a detailed study of at least one of his plays. That's all. Thank you very much, Ms. Tiffany, and also thank you very much to University of Basra about this lecture. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Dr. Maysoon, please.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Hello, Professor. So happy to hear you here. And thank you so much for your informative and interesting presentation. Thanks a lot. I just have one question, if you don't mind. I'm asking about the time according to Shakespeare, whether he presented it as a double-edged sword, as enemy and as a friend at the same time. What do you think, Professor? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, and we often find in his plays, he presents time very differently, depending on which character is thinking about it, and also depending on what moment we've reached in the play. And I think he is very conscious of the fact that if you're looking forward to something, it seems to retreat far away in time. And if you're dreading something, it seems to hurry to meet you. And he often stages that time as an enemy and a friend, and time perversely hurrying when you don't want it to, and slowing down when you don't want it to. So yes, and so I think he was highly conscious of that. And I think as well, maybe once again, we are so conscious of clock time that we might forget how our experience of time is also very different depending on whether we want or don't want something to happen. So yes, I think you've made a very important observation about the way Shakespeare uses time in as you said, in a double-edged way. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maysoon. Okay, if anyone has a question, they can, as I said, raise the hand. Okay, so I think we have Mariam.
Yes, Doctor, good evening.
Good evening.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. It was really amazing meeting. I have just one question. As Mr. Tiffany said, that some plays of Shakespeare was used the question, what's o'clock? Can we use this in this day, or we just can use what's the time?
Oh yes, okay, that's an interesting question. We no longer say what is it o'clock? We no longer ask that. But so these days we'd say, what is the time? But someone would answer, it's 3 o'clock. And they don't realize that what they're actually saying is, it's 3 according to my clock, meaning it might be 4 according to the sun or something. So yes, so these days we say it's 3 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock. So we often have the clock as part of the way we have the word clock as part of the way we tell the time. But we have now forgotten that the reason we have the word clock in there is to signal that the time might be inaccurate, because these days, of course, clocks are accurate. So we no longer say what's o'clock, we say what's the time. But we do say it's 3 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock. So we still have that clock unit left over from the past in our answers. And I'll tell you another really weird thing that's a unit of time that has slipped really strangely across different bits of the language, and that's the word dial. And I said that so a sundial, the word dial comes from the Latin dies, meaning day. So it's a measurement of the day, sundial. But then a clock has a face, and the word dial was taken from sundial and used for a clock. So a clock face came to be called a dial because it was the surface of a clock, like the sundial had a surface. So dial leapt from sundial onto clock. But then, because we forgot its original meaning, we came to think that dial meant something round, because a clock dial is round. So when we invented the telephone and it had a round central bit, we called that the telephone dial. And now we no longer have telephones with that round central bit. We usually have a mobile phone. But we still talk about dialing our friend, or dial my number, or so that word dial, it's still a verb, and it's gone from sundial to clock dial to telephone dial to the verb to dial. And it's completely lost all connection with its original meaning, but it's another strange time word that has now hopped onto our telephones.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mariam. Tiffany, regarding the inaccuracy of the telling of time in the early modern period, and the difficulty to measure time with with minutes or seconds or even seconds, and sometimes even hours in the time of the night when there is no sun and so on. So I wonder if there is a different concept of the self or subjectivity from the modern day, when we have a different more accurate measurement of time, and maybe now even the clocks that we are using are not accurate enough. That's why some scientists are using atomic clocks, maybe in satellites and so on, GPS systems, where when they need very accurate measurement of time, to which even the clocks that we are using now cannot amount. So do you think that these different measurements of time create different kinds of subjectivities, and even in the future, when we arrive to even more accurate measurements of time, the subjectivity will be different from it is now?
Wow, that's a huge philosophical question, and an excellent one. And you must be right, because as we measure our being through time, if we measure time differently, we therefore are measuring the way we live a little bit differently. So that must be the case. And I certainly think the fact that in the early modern period, you would know a clock was inaccurate, but you would have a loyalty to your church's clock and your time and your clock jack, and that time wasn't an objective truth in quite the same way, but was uniting you in a little community of other people who also got the time from that church. I think that itself, and your earlier point that time was also tied to religion, all of these must have shaped your personality in certain ways. And yes, and now we can't get time that's accurate enough. And there are all kinds of concepts like being late or being punctual that you couldn't have in the early modern period in quite the same way. Because if I were arranging to meet you, I would name my source of time. I'd say, well, I'll meet you at 3 o'clock by Bow Bells. And you'd go, well, I'll be there at 3 o'clock by the Exchange. And then we'd meet together at some time roughly hovering around 3, but much vaguer than 3 o'clock these days is. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I think there are deeper levels of answer to that question, which at this point, I don't think I can get to, but it's a fabulous question. Yes, I'm sure time is a quintessential part of the self, and therefore different ways of getting hold of time affect the way you conceive of yourself and others. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have Sarah.
Oh, hello, Doctor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good evening to everyone. So I just was thinking about Dr. Samer's question, and then I was just thinking in another point of view. So if it, regarding to the theater, I mean, it was an open, it was like in an open air in that time. So regardless of the like accuracy of measuring the time, sorry. So don't you think that they have to stick to that time due to the circumstances they went through, that it was an open air and there are a lot of gathers of people around, and maybe they cannot get the attention of everyone for more than 2 hours?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it is often said that we have a shorter attention span these days than they had. That computers and televisions have made us be so visual, and we're opening many pages and hopping between different sites at the same time, and people are less good at sitting down and reading a great big novel than they used to be. So it may be so that people couldn't really handle more than 2 hours, but as the plays as written tend to take longer than 2 hours, I think you'd be pretty pleased to have a bit more of this wonderful entertainment. Yes, I think that, but you do also make the point that if you're going to stand and if it's raining, you're maybe less pleased. And one thing I suspect, which will be another reason why we can't say how long a play lasted, will be that if the audience are really enjoying it, you'll elongate it. And if the audience are restless and getting annoyed, you'll probably cut it quite short and hop to the end. You know, you're going to give the audience what they want. So I also suspect that different performances took different lengths of time, not least because in the summer there's lots of sun and you can go comfortably into the evening and it will still be light. And in the winter, the weather's bad and the light's bad. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if plays weren't shorter in winter and longer in summer too. But thank you, that's a great question.
Thank you for answering me.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Zainab?
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay, Dr. Tiffany, I want to ask you a certain question about the toolkit that you adopt to conduct such a wonderful, interesting presentation about Shakespeare's perspective about time. So my question is, what sort of toolkit that you adopt to deduce such a thing? And is this your own purely subjective point of view about Shakespeare's perspective about time? Is it what definitely Shakespeare's means about time, or it is just your own illustration about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would like to hope that it is both. You know, I'm quite a I have a very historical approach to Shakespeare, and very often what I do is, you know, I like being a sort of detective, and I like working out something about the past. So, so as I say, I started by being annoyed with the people who said that the Shakespeare plays we have are all too long, are all longer than 2 hours, and are therefore rewritten for the page literary versions and are not the same as was put on the stage. And I didn't like that because I thought that was a bit anti-performance and was trying to make the texts we have something different from the performed text when we know that Shakespeare was writing plays for the stage. So originally, I simply wanted to look at the issue of, did plays really take 2 hours? But then I asked myself, how might one measure 2 hours in Shakespeare's time? And that's when I started researching the different ways of telling the time in Shakespeare's period. And having researched each of the different ways, I then looked through the plays for examples where Shakespeare was definitely talking about one way of measuring time, or definitely talking about another way of telling the time. So I would say that those are all factual, but I would then say that the spin I put on it will be my own interpretation. But I tried to show the facts so that you could see why I was interpreting or reading them as I was. So, you know, and as with any interpretation, it's open to question, but I think the factual differences between the different ways of measuring time, and then the fact of the different vocabulary Shakespeare uses around them also makes quite a solid case. But what I do think is that the case I made could be expanded into yet further ways of telling the time in that period, particularly at night.
Thank you, Doctor. But still, I guess Time's perspective uploads so many explanations, I guess, because, you know, everyone has his own perspective about time, depending on the cultural background, depending on subjective background there, actually. Thank you. It was so interesting presentation, actually. We are so interested with it.
Thank you, and thank you for your excellent question. Yes, time indeed is, and I think the cultural aspect is a very intriguing point. And yes, I'd be interested to know more about historically the different ways of telling time in Iraq, for instance, and how they relate to the methods I was talking about, and whether there were other methods. I think in Roman times there were methods of telling time with dripping water. And yes, I think different cultural methods of telling time, and how again that feeds into one's subjectivity. That could be a whole wonderful other talk, though it would not be a Shakespeare one. But it's extremely interesting. So thanks for your question.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. I have Adwa. She was like raising her hand, but now I don't know if she is still interested in asking or saying anything. Yes, Adwa.
Yes, Doctor. Hello, everybody here, and I will appreciate for this interesting lecture, and especially thanks for Ms. Tiffany and Dr. Samer. So I want to talk about the relation between Shakespeare and time. We know Shakespeare as he considered a famous literature writer, and he a dramatist and novelist. So why he always talking about the time in his many works? And always he has a different view about the time. So we know he is a philosophical and a psychological one. So it's depend on what? Why he always talking about the time? We know the time is very important, but I want a specific reason. And thank you.
Thanks for your question. It's a good question. I suspect there isn't one specific reason, and there'll be both practical reasons and philosophical reasons why he talks about time a lot. And the practical reasons will be that in a stage with no scenery and where there weren't spotlights or anything like that, you have to locate the fiction. So you have to have people saying, oh, it's so late at night. Oh, yes, it's midnight. Oh, it's 2 a.m. Because otherwise there's no way you can tell. The stage is light, it's lit by daylight. So unless people say it's nighttime, you're not going to know. So I think there's one completely practical reason why he talks about time a lot, and that's to tell you what the fictional time is, and then to tell you when the fictional time changes. So that's one reason. But as we've also seen, thinking about time makes one think about death, makes one think about religion, makes one think about the self. So I think he needs to mention time for practical reasons, but then that becomes a whole philosophical reflection as well. And I think time is one of those deep things we think about a bit like, even if we're not religious, we think about time because we know we start young and we end up old, and we know we're going towards death and all those sad things. So time is of philosophical importance to all of us, as it was for Shakespeare, as well as I say, he had practical reasons for mentioning the time a lot. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you very much. I don't know if there is any other question or any other comment, because we are approaching the 2-hour traffic of our lecture, maybe. Yeah. Okay, so since there appears to be no further questions or comments, I would like to thank you, Tiffany, very much for this very exciting talk about time, which can help us think about time in Shakespeare and time in general in literature in a new way. And this information about early modern period and about different ways or tools to measure time, these were freshly new to every one of us. So thank you very much for being our guest at the University of Basra College of Arts. It was very kind of you to give us these 2 hours of your precious time. Thanks a lot, and I wish that would not be the last talk you give at the University of Basra.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful invitation, and thank you all for your excellent questions. And yes, I'd love to speak to you again at some point. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you, everyone.
Okay.
And have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Okay. Bye.